This is the Serge Slip 5. And this is a production slip joint from Serge. I'm just going to let it go. It's going to lean back like that. It doesn't look so great. You know what? I'm going to show this knife on the clip side because I don't like the way it sits on the show side. So my goal with these reviews is to give you a single review that gives you everything you need to know to make an informed purchase decision and to know whether this is the right knife for you or not. I'm going to try to do that as quickly as I can, but I'm going to focus on being complete more than being concise. We'll work on being concise as I do more of these and get a little better. I go through these reviews in 5 sections. First, I give you an overview of what the knife is. Then I talk about the blade, transition between the blade and handle with a little talk about the action. Then go to the handle, talk about fit, finish, and value, and then finish with some overall thoughts. Let's get to it. First off, what does Serge? So Serge there is a relatively well-known custom knife designer, or at least he was most well-known as a custom knife designer for a very long time. And he has this aesthetic. I forget exactly where he's from. Well, I believe he's based in America now, but I believe he's somewhere from the former Soviet nations. But he has this heavily acid-washed aesthetic where everything goes through an acid bath in every single one of his knives. He also has very pared down, but also very organic design language. There's lots of very natural, like small screws, lots of big slabs of titanium, very natural curves everywhere. There's rarely any straight lines. This is, even having this straight line back here is relatively rare for a Serge, and even then it sort of rounds off back here. You can see the clip shape is very just sort of organic is really the first term that comes to mind. Even his maker's mark there has that sort of scratched nature to it. That's how he does his customs. That's also how he does his production knives. And over the past, 4 or 5 years, he has started doing more production and or mid-tech work. These are part of his production knives. This, like most of his production work, is done by Real Steel for him out in China. He does a handful of slip joints. He does a handful of locking knives with them as well. And then on occasion, he has also done some mid-tech work with, I believe, Millet knives in Idaho, where he's had some versions of his Bean, which were these tiny little flipper knives, very fun, very cool little things made by Millet. These are available right now from a lot of retailers. Again, these are the Slip 5. Came out at the same time as, let's get it out here, the Slip 7, which I also have and will be reviewing separately because it deserves a separate review. You can get these with this stone-washed titanium. He also just put out some, and these are available on his site as well, with a bronze finish on the titanium that looks really cool. These are a slip joint. So very simple design, 2 slabs of titanium with a back spring here, no lock. So you simply grab it at the nail nick here and pull it open. And then to close it, there's nothing locking it. There's no lock to disengage. You just push it. There's a little bit of resistance. Half stop right there. It is flush at the half stop, meaning this back spring is flush with the scales. And then you keep pushing it and it snaps down. We'll talk about that action a little bit later. Price and specs. So this is a $150 knife, again, made in China by Real Steel. 2.7 inches on your blade, 110,000 on your blade stock, so pretty thin on the blade stock. M390 is your steel. There we go, it says it right there. They are serialized. You can see I've got number 27. And then, as is typical for slip joints, because they're such simple knives, they can be quite light. This is, again, a 2.7 inch blade, and it only weighs 1.92 ounces, which is great. That's definitely one of the pluses. And again, this one here with the carbon fiber scales is even lighter. This is obviously titanium scales. Those are your specs. So let's get into it. And let's start with the blade. First off, this blade shape, this is such a Serge blade shape. I mean, it's not quite like anything else out there. if you really take the design away, and honestly, it's kind of like Dave Ridbaum at Kingdom Armory does a lot of the same stuff. If you look at just the bottom of this blade and you hide the top, this actually is almost sheep's footy in the sense that, like, or almost Warncliffey in the sense that there's a very small, it's technically all belly, but there's just a small upward sweep the whole length of the blade here. But then the way he does it, rather than, having a gradual movement out to the tip or a gradual slope out to the tip, he carries that blade thickness most of the way out. There's a swedge here that hides the fact that it's still pretty thick until about here, until it really starts that distal taper. And you just end up with this super pointy, super acute shape that you want to say looks like a Warncliffe, but it's got way too much belly, way too much curve to be a Warncliffe. This ends up just being a knife that feels like a what is it, like a splinter puller. Like, this is a tiny little pokey thing. And it's really, really good for tiny little pokey cuts and for getting around things and all those tiny little fine detail work. This blade feels like it's made for it when you look at it. There is, however, a problem with the blade. And that problem is the grind. Now, Real Steel is not at the top tier of Chinese knife manufacturers. They are, these days, some people would put Best Tech increasingly close to Ria, but you've got Ria, you got Best Tech, you got Wee Knives, you got maybe one or two others. Custom Knife Factory, who are increasingly obviously making their knives in China. Those sorts of ones are at your upper echelon. Real Steel is definitely in the next tier down of Chinese knife makers and Chinese OEMs. And the place that you see it the most on this blade is the grind, and even more than the grind, the factory edge. So, for a slip joint, and with this blade shape, this, especially on a slip joint, is meant to be a really fine-duty, light-duty knife that should be super slicey and super sharp. This thing could be an amazing letter opener, an amazing little box opener, great for, all your little around-the-house tasks. You combine that with the fact that it's only 1.92 ounces and that it is this small in the pocket. I'm getting ahead of myself a bit, but you would think with the design philosophy of this knife that this thing could be a super thin, super acute, awesome slicer. Out of the box, it could not have been less that. This knife, the factory edge it came with, sucked. This thing couldn't cut paper effectively. It could, but it would tear it. It would sort of just drag its way through note cards. Cutting cardboard with it was an absolute pain. And honestly, when I tried to use it out in the garden, it just failed. I tried to use it a little bit, and it just wasn't sharp enough to do most of the cutting tasks that I needed to. So I took it to my sharpener. I put a 17-degree edge on there. It was not the finest edge I've ever put. I can tell by how much the bevel fattened that they put a relatively fat factory edge on here, especially toward the base. Not my best sharpening job, but still, this part up here gets pretty sharp. But yes, it came with a pretty fat factory edge. But the problem is, even after I sharpen this, now it's acute at the edge, so now it does bite into stuff, but still, when I cut through things, 110 thousandths blade stock, that's not that much thicker than something like a TRM Atom. And in fact, that reminds me, I completely neglected to do my size comparisons to show just how small this knife is. And you know what? I'll put everything up clip side. Way smaller than your Atom. Way smaller than your PM2. I mean, this is just a small knife. And if I compare this to I don't have my Neutron with me right now, otherwise I compare it to that. Small Sebenza, you can see it's even dwarfed by the small Sebenza. This is a legitimately small knife. But even with a, my edge on it, this is just a relatively flat grind. You can see if you look at the base of the blade there, you want a knife that is meant to be delicate and slicey like this, and that only has 110,000 on the blade stock, to get thinner than that behind the edge, and to feel slicier than this thing does. It's not bad, but everything about this design screams pointy, pokey, light duty. This is get the tweezer out of my finger, open my envelopes for me, little stuff like that. And the blade just isn't made for it. The blade just isn't slicey enough for that. I love the aesthetic design of the blade. I think, honestly, the grind that was put on it lets this blade down a bit. And it just... I have never enjoyed carrying this knife, even though the carry profile is exceptional, because the second that I start to use it, I would rather have almost any other small knife in my collection than this one. Just for a quick comparison, like, the blade stock is not that much thinner than a Dragonfly. And that's why I should have done as a size comparison. It's a little bit larger than a Dragonfly. Probably a little bit smaller in terms of overall footprint in your pocket. You can see that when it's folded up. The Dragonfly is a larger object in the pocket, really. But the Dragonfly is a supreme slicer. It takes that thin blade stock and gets down to a thin edge that cuts darn near everything. That's what a small knife should aspire to be. This is not that. The blade grind lets it down. Then we got to talk about the action. Now, Serge has instructed his retailers to disclose this on every single product page. So it's not like this is an error by Serge or that he doesn't know it's the case, but this is a light walk and talk. If you want to talk about in terms of a number, it's like a 4. And the reason for that is because so little of this blade is exposed, you've really got to get into that nail nick to pull it out. Now, I don't mind the light walk and talk on the open and close. In fact, it's kind of fun in the sense that you can just pull it out really quickly and easily. It's the opposite of something like a Jack Wolf. I've owned a bunch of Jack Wolves, so it's not like I'm new to slip joints. I don't do the old school slip joints, but I should say it's not like I'm new to modern slip joints. I've owned quite a few of them. This, I don't care that this doesn't have that snappy walk and talk of something like a Jack Wolf. The problem is that because this spring tension is so light, there is very little, especially if I get, this blade, again, for a small pointy blade like this, you often want to put your finger out here and, lever on it for stuff. The second that I do that, this thing wants to fold in on itself almost immediately. And if you stab it into something, if you actually use the pokey tip to do pokey stuff, then if there's even a bit of pressure, you try to move the handle, this thing is going to want to snap. Usually it's the half stop, so it's got that safety feature, but it's going to want to snap toward the closed position on you. In fact, this is the only slip joint knife I've ever used that I've actually had unintentionally close halfway on me during use. Obviously, for a slip joint, you just can't use them as hard as locking knives. That's an inevitability of the form factor. But because of that light spring tension, it has to be there because otherwise this thing would be impossible to open. But with it present, it just feels less safe and less secure even than most slip joints, which already skeeve me out a little bit relative to my locking knives. And so it's another reason that I haven't loved carrying this, which is a shame because when we get to the handle is great considering what it is. First off, I enjoy Serge's aesthetic because it's distinct. There is, with this acid wash blade, the same acid wash finish, the way he matches the finish between the steel and the titanium, which isn't a trivial thing. You got to consider these are two different materials. They're going to take finishes differently, but he manages to match the finishes very nicely. This is a cool and wholly distinct knife. Serge is one of those designers that you can look at his stuff and immediately see that's a Serge Panchenko. I've got another one of his here, review coming up for this one. I've got his even tinier Leaf, which is, by the way, a much more compelling knife. Same thing, you can see the same organic lines. Swoopy everywhere. I mean, this one almost looks like a plant. Even if you took away the acid wash finish, it's distinctively Serge. And the way this handle sort of, it almost looks like a piece of a part of a plant or something like that. The way it just gradually swells out. There's nice chamfers all the way around the edges. Again, your back spring is flush toward the back and flush in all three positions when you open and close it. The clip has that nice rounded organic look to it. It works just fine. It's a bent clip. It works just fine. Not too much hardware. And then ergonomically, for a slip joint for the intended use, which is light use, it's solid. It's got a little bit of that Sebenza thing going where it looks like a neutral handle, but it expands toward the back, which means that your hands have there's something really secure for your pinky and your palm to grab onto while the rest of your fingers wrap around. Honestly, this grip here, if this was a locking knife and this had a better grind, I would mostly be like pinching it like this. I would still be using it as a smaller knife, even grabbing it like this. But the handle is a plenty fine neutral handle. In the hand like this, yeah, it feels small. You're never going to use the knife like that. For the stuff you're realistically going to use, you're going to pull it out, you're going to pop it open, and then you're usually going to grab it like this or pinch it like that, or just basically get your hands on the blade in some way or another, and your other fingers are just sort of trailing behind. This handle does the job. Because everything is knocked down nicely, because there's no ridiculous curves or anything like that, it's a solid handle. It looks cool. It fits Serge's design aesthetic in those really subtle ways. That's the mark of a veteran designer. Having that consistent language. Kind of like Marcin Swish's stuff, kind of like Peter Ricenti's stuff, things like that. There's nothing distinctive about the handle more than the way it looks. It's a solidly designed neutral handle. Now, unfortunately, it ends up feeling a little unergonomic compared to what you'd expect, but that is mostly just because this blade doesn't cut as well as you would want it to. If this was a really sharp blade, either with a more aggressive flat grind or even with a hollow grind on it, I don't think I would have any ergonomic issues with this handle. It's meant to be a lightweight slip joint handle. And in that sense, it is easy to grab in any position you want. It's easy to pull out of your pocket and get perched onto. And then because of this swoop toward the back, it does give you that little bit more grip when you need it. It's a full 4-finger knife. And then on top of that, legitimately tiny in the pocket. 1.92 ounces for 2.7 inches of blade. Again, compare this to Sebenza. Your small Sebenza has a great carry profile. This thing is tiny. This is one of those knives that legitimately disappears in the pocket. This thing is like the size of, you take 3 sticks of gum and you stack 3 sticks of gum on top of each other. That's the size of this knife. So the carry profile is really, really good. And again, if this knife was slicier, it would be a really cool secondary knife. It would be a really cool backup knife. It would be a really cool knife that you can just kind of throw anywhere, or that you can slide into your coin pocket in your jeans or something like that. So the design in general, both the handle and the blade, I have very few issues with the design, though, as I said extensively on the blade part and a little bit about the action, I do think Real Steel let this one down on the execution. I'll tell you, I can't really tell you that much in terms of heat treat. I can't tell you. Yeah, I can't tell you that much in terms of heat treat. I used this a little bit before I sharpened it. The factory edge was so bad that I couldn't even tell if it was losing sharpness or not. It was dull from the start. I haven't used it that much, and honestly, the stuff that I'm using this for is not dulling this edge quickly at all. I know a lot of Chinese OEMs tend to treat their M390 soft. Real Steel may or may not be one of them. The fact is, it's Chinese M390, so you probably have an opinion about that already. Finish value. I've already talked about a lot of that. I do think the manufacturing lets this design down. I also think, frankly, $150. On one hand, it feels a little expensive for the level of quality that you're getting here. And that's the case for a lot of Serge's designs with Real Steel. Like, the fit and finish looks very good. They do a really good job of communicating his design aesthetic very faithfully. It's the function where it starts to get let down a little bit. So they make stuff that looks fantastic. And honestly, a lot of Real Steel stuff, even when you look at it in person, looks about as well finished and put together, if less elaborate, but looks as nice as some of Serge's customs. But then you start to use them and you realize that the function just isn't quite there. And that's where 150 starts to feel a little expensive for this. Now the problem is, it's still a Serge. Nobody's making stuff that looks quite like Serge. This is Serge's own work. He hasn't shopped it out to an OEM, or to another company. The only design I know of that he's done for other companies, I guess he did a couple designs for Spyderco. He did the Rock and the dog tag. He might have done one or two things for Fox or Kaiser or one of them, but the fact is, none of them look like a Serge as much as this looks like a Serge. If you want a Serge Panchenko, this is a cheap way to get a Serge Panchenko, and $150 isn't bad to get a Serge Panchenko. But if you're paying $150 for this, know that you're paying for it because you like the design, because you like Serge. I mean, he seems like a very amicable and nice guy in general, somebody that's worth supporting. But you are getting this because you like that aesthetic, because you like that design, not because this is a great buy for $150. Now, if I compare this to something like Jack Wolf, this is half the price of a Jack Wolf. Jack Wolves are $300 for Chinese-made slip joints, but those are at a level of fit and finish and execution, especially on the blade grind, that is significant steps above this one. I haven't handled a lot of the other modern slip joints, but still, $150, just, you're paying for the design. That's where I'll end that. And so when it comes to overall thoughts and conclusions, it's a disappointing knife for me. Because my first impression, when I first picked this up, when I first looked at it, when I first carried it, before I ever cut with it, I thought this was really well done. I was kind of impressed with Real Steel because I haven't had any of Serge's slip joints before. I've had plenty of his production knives before, but I haven't had any of Serge's production slip joints before. And I knew that Real Steel wasn't at the top of the Chinese knife-making sort of hierarchy. And I was like, okay, it looks like they nailed this design. This looks like a Serge, even when I look close to details. You know, when I look at the finishing of the screws, when I look at did they get the acid wash correctly on the chamfering, when I look at, you know, just all the little bits of finishing everywhere, this looks good. But then when I started using it, the blade starts to really let you down. The blade of this is just not what you want in a modern slip joint. And so I carried this the few times I needed to review it and to get a sense for whether I liked it or not. But since I got done and sort of had my review sorted in my head for this, I have not carried it at all since, and I don't plan on carrying it again, despite the fact that I really, really, really want to like this knife. I like having it on my desk. I like seeing it on my desk. I like having it in my pocket. It's such a cool object to have on me. Now, I like Serge's design. It is something that resonates with me. I used to have some of his mid-tech beans. I've never had his customs. They're out of my price range, but I like what Serge does. I think it's distinct. Again, not just the acid wash. I like the subtly organic nature of a lot of his designs. And so I really, really wanted to like this knife. But I just don't. And it really comes down to the second that I came to use it, that light action is mostly a quibble. Like, honestly, if this thing was super slicey, the action wouldn't bother me. Because the only reason that this here is a problem, it's not really that unsafe. It's not like it's super light. I mean, it's lighter than most modern slip joints, but it's not like it's crazy. It just ends up feeling light because I often have to push this blade more than I want to because the damn thing just isn't ground that sharp. The fact is, and honestly, I've thought about this looking at some of Serge's other production knives, like the Rager and stuff like that. By this point, I almost wonder if Serge would be better served, instead of selling these for $150 through Real Steel, with Real Steel as his OEM, using somebody like, I mean, I don't think does slip joints, but using somebody like a Riot, or I've seen Best Tech start to do slip joints, using somebody in that one tier up, or probably one of the other OEMs. I'm sure there are other OEMs that are quite good that I'm just not as familiar with. Using somebody that's one step up, charging, you know, $225, $250 for this knife instead of $150, and providing a knife that is not just aesthetically faithful to the design, but that is actually an excellent performer, I think this would be a much more compelling knife with that setup. And when I handle these Serge slip joints, and it's more true for this one than for the Slip 7, but it's true for the Slip 7 as well. Spoiler alert on that review. It feels like a really, really cool and interesting design is being a little bit let down by not being produced at the standard that it could be. I'm sure that Serge has done what he's done for the right decisions, and I have no doubt that he's probably doing quite well in selling these, but I can just speak from my personal experience. I would find this much more compelling as a slightly better knife with a better blade grind and a slightly more refined action. Actually, even just a better blade grind, frankly, for $250 with a little bit of refinement you might get from that step up to an OEM. I would find that much more compelling personally than what's sitting here on my table right now for $150. That's me. The fact is, if all you care about is getting a Serge design, this is an entry-level Serge design. It is totally faithful to Serge's design. It is super cool and super interesting. And if you just want it to carry around and you don't care that it doesn't cut that well, you'll enjoy it. But just have a proper expectation that, especially if you are getting into those modern slip joints and you've gotten used to especially Jack Wolf knives, which are on the complete opposite end of the spectrum when it comes to blade grinds. I mean, Jack Wolf's blade grinds are absurd. They're some of the best production grinds that you're getting anywhere right now. If you're used to that and then you come over to this, you're going to be super disappointed by how this blade performs. So, think of this as an entry-level Serge, and with everything that entry-level contains. That entry-level means compromises. It does mean a more accessible price point, but it means compromise on execution. And frankly, it's not like $150 is cheap for a slip joint either. Like, if this was $90, I would be like, hey, it's a cheap knife, whatever. At $150, starts to feel a little bit more compromised than I want to. So, love the design. Still really like what Serge is doing in general. He is still doing some of the most interesting work in the entire knife-making world. And I look forward to more of these. I do, and I still, every time I see one, I still have an urge to pick one up, despite everything I've said about my experience with them. Both with the 5 and with your 7 over here. The Leaf, which I'll review soon. By the way, this little Leaf, markedly better than the other ones. This one is a keeper. The other two are not. But that's for another review. Hope you found this helpful. Hope you gave this a better understanding. Hope this gave you a better understanding of this Serge Panchenko Slip 5. $150 made for him by Real Steel in China. Hope you found this to be a good use of your time. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. And I will see you again soon.